This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening and welcome to the ARA 2017 Refugee Oration. I'd like you all now to please stand for the entrance of the Governor of South Australia, the Honourable Hugh Van Lay. Please be seated. Good evening and welcome again. So many wonderful familiar faces in the audience. My name is Amanda Blair and I am your MC tonight. And it's always very nice welcoming a governor into a room, but it makes it particularly nice on a night like this when our governor was once a refugee. So again, welcome to you, Hugh. Thank you so much for being here. I'd also like to acknowledge that the land that we meet on today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and we acknowledge and respect their connection to place, both past and present. A lot to get through tonight. Special guests all mic'd up, ready to give a powerful speech, no doubt. But before we go any further, could you please put your hands together just for Jacinta Thompson, Executive Director of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre.
Good evening and a very warm welcome to you all from the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you here, as I said, on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia, to hear from, I think, one of Australia's, and I'm sure you agree with me, one of Australia's most respected community leaders, the Reverend Tim Costello AO, and a very warm welcome on this chilly night. Thank you, Tim, for joining us. We are very pleased to be co-presenting this event with the Australian Refugee Association, and I would like to thank their CEO, Kirsten Bickendorf, thank you, and her fabulous team for their support in organising this event, and also a warm welcome to board members as well. I would like to acknowledge His Excellency, the Honourable Hugh Van Lay AC, Governor of South Australia, Professor Luicha O'Donoghue, AC, CBE, DSG, and Foundation Patron of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. Luicha, welcome and thank you. Lois Boswell, President of the Australian Refugee Association, thank you. The Hawke Centre is committed to delivering a free and diverse program of exhibitions, lectures and events throughout the year, which reflect our fundamental themes of strengthening our democracy, valuing our diversity and building our future. The session tonight is being filmed and will be available for viewing on our Hawke Centre website next week. As we are filming, can I please ask that you switch your phones to silent so that we don't have any interruptions? But those of you who want to join in the Twitter conversation, please use the hashtags on the screen behind me. I do ask that you remain seated until the conclusion of the event, following the vote of thanks. If you must leave prior to this, can I please ask that you exit the middle side doors just over here where the little green light is, just so that we do not have any interruptions for the speakers. Tim will also be taking questions after his presentation. So now I will hand back to the delightful Amanda. And here she is.
Wow. Delightful's not a word that's used very often with me, Jacinta, but thank you for your politeness. Wonderful, as I said, to have Hugh Van Lay here. He is a magnificent South Australian. For those of you that were at his, is it inauguration? Is that what it's called? Your swearing-in ceremony. I think one of the most moving things I've ever seen in an official capacity was Hugh and his wife, Lan, sitting up on the stage, and at the very end of the ceremony, they played John Lennon's Imagine, and there was not a dry eye in the house. It was absolutely spectacular. I was also pleased to know that one of the first things that Hugh did when he became governor was to go out into the garden at Government House and to demand that they plant lemongrass. So it's gives me great comfort that in Government House lemongrass is currently being grown. So can you please put your hands together for the Governor of South Australia, Hugh Van Lay.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you very much, everybody, for a warm welcome. May I start by acknowledging the Reverend Tim Costello, the keynote speaker tonight, Ms. Lois Boswell, President, and Kirsten Bickendorf, the CEO of this ARA, my great idol, Louita O'Donoghue. It's wonderful to see you here tonight. Jacinta Thompson, Bob Hawke, Prime Minister, Rio Centre, Amanda Blair, of course. Ladies and gentlemen, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodian of the land that we are gathering here tonight, the Kaurna people, and we respect their spiritual relationship with the country. I'm so pleased to be here with you this evening. 7 years ago, the ARA Oration was established to provide a public platform in South Australia to share the journey and the experiences of people from a refugee background, and also to discuss issues and challenges concerning refugees and humanitarian efforts. The purpose was to expand the conversation about refugees beyond current supporters and advocates, and to engage a wider audience and cross-section of our community. I am so pleased to see this has been a resounding success. It was my honour to deliver the inaugural oration, and since then the event has grown enormously in popularity, and now I've been told that for tonight's session, all seats were taken up shortly after tickets are released. The popularity of this event reflects the strong engagement of so many South Australians with the plight of refugees around the world. It reflects the public's interest in the topic, the compassion of our community, and the commitment of so many South Australians to support the refugees who settle in our state as they rebuild their lives and develop a sense of belonging into our society. Earlier this year at Government House, the guest speaker at our annual celebration of culturally diverse was George Megalogenis, a well-known author and commentator on Australia's migration history. He shared with us a very interesting pattern about the impact of immigration policy in Australia's history in the past 200 years. At times when Australia's openness to migration and cultural diversity has been at its highest, our economy has prospered the most, and living standards have been at their highest. At times when we have become fearful and closed off from each other and from the world, we have suffered the consequences, not just in economic terms, but also in our social harmony and overall well-being. He said, and I quote, "Australia's least productive and most divisive eras have been those when migration was at its lowest ebb," unquote, referring to the early decades of convict settlement, the half-century of white Australia policy, and the period from the 1890s to the end of the Second World War. So, ladies and gentlemen, there has never been a more important moment in Australia's history to actively embrace our cultural diversity. This is one of the keys to our nation's strength and prosperity. I'm delighted that we have with us this evening the Reverend Tim Costello, who will look at the Australia's opportunities and responsibilities in terms of migration, focusing on refugees and the global reality of 65 million displaced people. Reverend Costello's compassion and insight never failed to leave a deep impression on me, and I have no doubt that he will present a thought-provoking discussion on what we appreciate are very complex issues. I would like to thank the Australian Refugee Association for organising this annual oration and for its commitment to providing advocacy and support to the refugees in our community. My wife, Lana, and I are, of course, two people who came to these countries as refugees. When arriving in a new country, there are many things that a refugee needs. They need shelter, they need some forms of income, they may need language assistance, they need assistance in adjusting to a new country, they need assistance settling their families and so on. Many of these things are material needs. But I can tell you from personal experience that the thing that was of the greatest support to Lan and I at that time was the hand of friendship and the support extended to us by Australians like you. And that friendship, that spirit of welcome are the powerful source of strength, giving us the confidence that made everything else possible. I'm so pleased to see how the South Australian community has embraced this event, and I hope to see it continue to grow in popularity and impact for many years to come. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.
Right, glasses on because I'm reading the biography, as I should. It's worthy of it. The Reverend Tim Costello AO is one of Australia's best-known community leaders and a sought-after voice on social justice issues. Actually, before I go any further, please turn your phones on silent. However, please tweet if you are a social media user. He's giggling. At AusRefugee is our Twitter handle, and our hashtag is hashtag 2017 ARA Oration. Have you got that? I shall continue. Tim was Chief Executive of World Vision Australia for 13 years, placing the challenges of global poverty on the national agenda. In his current role as Chief Advocate for World Vision, Tim continues to use his public profile to effect change, like this evening. Tim is the Chair of the Community Council of Australia and is a member of numerous boards and committees, including the Campaign for Australian Aid and the Alliance for Gambling Reform. He has been Mayor of St Kilda, a Baptist minister at St Kilda Baptist and Collins Street Baptist in Melbourne, as well as Executive Director of Urban Seed. In these roles, he spearheaded public debate on problem gambling, urban poverty, homelessness, reconciliation and substance abuse. All the happy subjects. Well done. Tim was named Victorian of the Year in 2004 and made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2005 and was named Victoria's Australian of the Year in 2006. He is also one of Australia's 100 national living treasures. As my grandmother would say, Tim Costello is a good egg, and he is a man who has used his life with purpose, and that is deeply admirable. Please welcome him to the stage.
Thank you. My grandmother would say exactly the same, not necessarily about me, but that phrase. Thank you for coming out tonight. I walked down from the Stamford Hotel where the Hawke Centre's putting me up, opposite the casino, one of my favourite places, past the gaming rooms, past a gentleman's club, but they didn't look like gentlemen coming out. People dining and sitting out and having the wonderful Adelaide food, and the thought struck me, on a Friday night, you are coming to a very heavy and morally serious topic, but I think it's really a tribute to your humanity, of which the Governor spoke so personally. And I want to thank you for, on a Friday night, coming out to be thinking about these issues. I've only just met the Governor tonight, but I certainly know his story, and I'm very proud that World Vision, at the heart of the crisis, Indo-Chinese boats being pushed away, bought a ship, a deregistered ship, launched a thing called Operation Sea Sweep, started picking up people who were otherwise going to drown, kept trying to land them at neighbouring governments from Singapore to Malaysia, always being pushed away, worked the corridors of the UN, and was part of internationally embarrassing the world to say, on our watch, you're pushing people away and they're going to drown. And for World Vision to be part of that, as we know, the world got embarrassed, and a deal was worked out that if these governments, Hong Kong and others, would receive people, other countries, Canada, America, Australia, would actually resettle them. In some ways, we had a breakthrough then. We're in a similar situation today. But it's people with humanity, like you, who say, not on my watch, who come out and speak up, that inspires me. So tonight I want to talk about the position the world is in, the position Australia is in the way we deal with refugees. I want to highlight some of the paradoxes and some of the contrasts that I've observed in my work with World Vision, both as an individual, a citizen of Australia, and of the world. For the last 13 years of my work with World Vision, refugees and displaced people are central to our work and our mission in the world. When I address government who've slashed aid by 20%, in fact, we sort of had Donald Trump before Donald Trump, I'm starting to realise. He's talking of slashing aid by 28% in America. Well, we did that in the 2014 aid budget. And when I say to politicians and others, if you do not give displaced people hope that when the conflict settles in Syria or South Sudan, which I'll speak about, and the hope to hang in there and go back home, guess what? They're going to head to Europe. When you slash aid, and one of the reasons nearly 1 million people started heading toward Europe was with the underfunding of the camps, $27 a month that you're given for food. World Vision's the biggest partner with the World Food Programme in providing food. That was slashed from $27 a month that you can barely feed your family on to $17 a month. Why would Europe be surprised that so many started heading their way? You cut aid, which we've done, and people lose hope. People lose hope. Well, the Australian Refugee Association and so many other organisations have been wonderfully active in this area. Like them, this is part of our calling, to walk with and alongside fellow human beings in need. I personally think a paralysing, toxic debate for 15 years about boat people in this country has damaged the Australian soul. I think that when you can't have what I call the ethics of proximity, desperate people arriving here on our shore, and you don't feel the ethical pull of that, it's little wonder you don't have the ethics of distance. Aid for people beyond this shore. It becomes thinkable to do the unthinkable. It's a turning inwards. We know the winds of retribalising are blowing globally, and it's happening here. Well, we work with displaced people as far apart as Kenya and Uganda, Iraq. I've just come back from out of Mosul in the 21 refugee camps where World Vision's working. Deeply moved by the courage, particularly of our young women staff who are working with children who can speak but don't speak because they've seen beheadings and crucifixions and bombings. and loving them back into a confidence that not all of life is evil and malevolent and cruel. Painting, dancing, hugging them, drawing with them, giving them just the belief that they're safe and that there can be something good in life. We work in Jordan, Lebanon, Myanmar, Haiti, Colombia, as well as humanitarian relief and development work. We do a lot of advocacy work, sometimes in public, often behind the scenes, trying to get policymakers, decision makers, to embrace the fact that these are humans. To therefore ask them to be, as governments, humane, and to act in humanitarian ways of seeing the world. The spectacles that we put on and look at other humans determines empathy and compassion and public policy. I read somewhere that if you took the human body from a lens of just its worth in terms of chemicals, there's enough fattiness to make 7 bars of soap, more in me probably than that. There's enough iron in us for 1 medium-sized nail. There's enough phosphorus for 2,000 match heads in the human body. There's a lot of water, there's some magnesium, there's enough sugar for 1 bowl of sugar from the human body. If you took all these elements down to a pharmacist and tried to sell them, you'd get $8. That's what we add up to. That's what an economic rationalist view of the human body would be. Other animals actually are much more worthwhile than us. We actually have to have a different lens of seeing human dignity, not simply in fear terms, in economic rationalist terms. For me, it comes from my faith. I believe every person carries the image of God, that they are God reflectors. In secular terms, that every human has rights and dignity, rights that are universal and indivisible. Well, when we do advocacy, it's really to shape policy by talking about humans and acting in a humane way, which is what humanitarianism is. Our humanitarian relief and development work certainly tries to raise dollars to get to these people, and we have the biggest footprint. Even as a Christian development agency, it might be interesting for you to know we have a much bigger footprint in Muslim countries, from Iraq and Syria, than Islamic relief, most Muslim philanthropic agencies put together. We're talking about humans. I digress, but it was a very proud moment when we responded to an earthquake in northwest Pakistan. Bin Laden was still alive. He was recruiting in that area. 80,000 Pakistanis died just 6 months after the tsunami, where we raised $105 million because Australians died, and it was on our doorstep. You couldn't raise $1 for northwest Pakistan. It was Muslim, northwest frontier, and World Vision and I went and we raised some dollars. We put in the water wells. I sat with mullahs, imams, very fundamentalist. And I'll never forget this moment, and I just pointed out, for those who wonder about a Christian development agency like World Vision, with tears running down their face, they thanked me and World Vision for being there and caring, and then they said, "But why are you here? You're Christian." I knew exactly what they were saying, and was proud to say, because Jesus didn't say, just love Christians. This, whether you're religious or not, sense of what does it mean to be human will be an echo coming through in this speech. But we do advocacy because when you raise dollars, it's really important. But we know if you don't fix the rules and public policy which advocacy addresses, often you just have to keep raising more and more dollars. It's dollars like water into a bucket with a hole in it. So advocacy is absolutely at the centre of addressing the challenges of humans, of human needs, and we're committed to all three. Well, if we want to understand the world of refugees and displaced people, 65 million displaced, about 20 million who are refugees, they've crossed boundaries. Knowing we only ever settle of that 20 million, 184,000 a year, we have to understand the context that produces refugee situations in the first place, to recognise the causes, not just the symptoms. We need to engage and communicate with people in government, in business, in community organisations, in the media, and particularly with the general public, which is hard. So let me start tonight with some personal experiences, impressions that I've witnessed in human displacement. And this year I've been in Somalia. The rains have failed for now 2 years in a row. The dams World Vision built are all dry. We started trucking water to keep their animals alive, goats and camels. Most of their animals have died. We're now trucking water to keep their children and families alive. They're walking 25 kilometres just for trucked water. I've been in Iraq, Mosul I've talked about. I've been in South Sudan. We'll have some poetry from South Sudan. I've been in Kenya, in Ethiopia. I'm totally struck by the fact that we have 23 million people at the point of starvation, the East Africa disaster of Yemen, South Sudan, Somalia. And yet when I talk to editors of newspapers, they say, Tim, this should be a front page story. But unless Trump is in the title, no one reads it these days. This is bigger than Live Aid 1984, when Bono and Bob and the world came together, and we can't even get any oxygen. And I say, what does it mean to be human today? We're obsessed with Trump's latest Twitter. By the way, here in Adelaide you have a former World Vision nurse, still a nurse I think, Sue Germain, some of you might know her, who was a World Vision nurse in Ethiopia at the height of the crisis. Bono's told me this story. I've since met Sue Germain. She was working for World Vision. Bono went out with his wife before Live Aid and the concert. He'd never been to Africa, never seen a disaster, wanted to inform himself. And as Bono put it to me, he said, this nurse from Australia, Adelaide, grabbed me by the voice box and dragged me to see suffering that I couldn't believe in hunger and malnutrition. And this nurse from Adelaide changed my life. Whenever U2 comes to Australia, Bono catches up still with Sue Germain. Someone from Adelaide helping Bono say, what does it mean to be human? I can't look away. Well, I was most recently in now one of the biggest refugee camps in the world, Bidi Bidi. You wouldn't have heard of it, but you should have heard of it. It's in the remote northwestern corner of Uganda. 1 million South Sudanese have crossed into Uganda in the last 12 months. A third of these are at Bidi Bidi. If Trump wasn't taking all the oxygen, we'd know about Bidi Bidi. To put that in context, 1 million refugees in the last 12 months have gone into Uganda and they haven't closed the border. What's more, the Ugandan government, this blows me away, gives every one of those refugees, after we've registered them and fed them and got them on their feet, 30 by 30 metres of land. We give them building materials, tools to garden and be self-sustainable, or start that. And the Ugandan government says, once you've got your land, you can live next to Ugandans, you can attend Ugandan schools, poor as they are. You can attend Ugandan health centres, poor as they are. You have the same rights as any Ugandan except the right to vote. 1 million South Sudanese in the last 12 months. In perspective, Australia has taken 845,000 refugees since 1945, the end of the Second World War. Why do the Ugandan leaders do it? Because they say once we were refugees under Idi Amin. This sense that disaster can befall any nation. It could even possibly befall Australia. And if we were fleeing, it'd have to be by boat. Would anyone take us? Well, what really moved me in Biddy Biddy was that World Vision had registered 9,000 unaccompanied children. Children who don't know if their parents are alive. Children who were told by their parents, because of both drought and ethnic communal violence in South Sudan, just follow the neighbours. Just follow the mass of suffering. And I watched these children turning up, days completely lost, having not eaten for 3 or 4 days, some with small backpacks, some with nothing, just tatters. World Vision registering them. I watched 8,000 meals, hot meals being served that first day. The first hot meal many of those who arrived had. And I was struck by the little backpacks. This year, the 40-hour famine, which has been going for 42 years, it's pretty significant, this. You know, ice bucket challenges come and go. For something to go 42 years is quite amazing. This year it's about refugees. We're asking students to wear a backpack with a few things to eat and sleep with it for 40 hours to imagine if they had to flee, what would they take? What could they put in that backpack? What would that be like? I watched some kids with these backpacks. When kids do the 40-hour famine, they can know statistics of 800 million people went to bed hungry last night. But it doesn't really enter your knowing. When you go without food for 40 hours, even though there's money in your wallet or purse and there's Macca's down the road and food in the fridge, to go without that, knowing that there are people like this because they have no choice, you know something in a different way of knowing. The empathy, the compassion, the sense of, that could be me. The great lottery of latitude threw me up here in Australia, but you don't choose the stage of life you're thrown up on. That could be me. Well, this year the 40-hour famine is about refugees. 9,000 unaccompanied children. In Biddy Biddy, we organise foster families, we care for them, other South Sudanese who we've set up who take them in. Well, when you see the eruption of an improvised city such as Biddy Biddy is, where they first are registered and then go out to get their 30 by 30 metres of land, you understand this ambiguous state of in-betweenness, of uncertainty, of something that's not permanent but seems more than just temporary. This metaphor of living in between, just wanting the conflict to stop because refugees by and large want to go home, not knowing how long you're going to be there. None of those people wanted to come, and in South Sudan, the push factor is powerful. Independence was achieved in 2011 after decades of struggle against the Khartoum government, dominated by northerners who differed in ethnicity, language and religion. Most of us wrongly thought, it's the bad Muslim Arab North and the Christian African Black American South. Soon as it has independence, it'll be fine. We failed to actually build institutions. There was really only 2 people who could lead. Salva Kiir, the President's Dinka, as our guests are, and Riek Machar was Nuer. And they said, well, they're the only 2 people, make 1 president, make 1 vice president, that should work. Of course, the fighting erupted, the ethnic tribalism buttons were pushed. I don't know why we thought it worked. In Australian political history, the only time I can think of this was when Billy McMahon displaced John Gorton, and so they made Billy McMahon Deputy Prime Minister. It lasted 6 days, that. Well, this is South Sudan pushing the ethnic button, and the country now convulsed by violence. Terrible, terrible suffering. Why those parents say to children, flee. Fragile environment where drought and famine threaten human life. Well, I've been to many places like Bidi Bidi. I never stop being shocked and surprised at the human damage wrought by human folly. Lives wrenched from normality, families broken, individuals suffering trauma and extreme violence, people living with injuries, disabilities, and just the terrible, unsettling transience of displacement. It's uncertainty that does the head in. We know this from Manus and Nauru, don't we? Yet, even in these places, I find hope and optimism. It seems to be stubborn, finding a way through the gloom, flowering in unlikely places. To begin with, although conditions in camps are basic, at least there's a place of comparative safety and refuge, some provision of the simple needs of shelter, food and hygiene. Child-friendly spaces, which is particularly something we offer, of play, of dance, of protection, give a chance for some childhood and normality. And human resilience comes to the surface. Before long, communal life of a sort takes shape, with people sharing and trading, praying and playing, building new relationships, communicating with each other, planning for the future. Yes, there's great privation and shortage. Yes, there's sometimes violence and crime. But what you also see in these camps, these transitory places, is solidarity, kindness, relationship. Because this is humanity. Humanity in its complexity and variety reasserting itself. A humanity I want to see reasserted in the hearts of Australians also. Bidi Bidi in environment might look like Australia, but it's in so many ways a million miles away. Australians are worldly, well-travelled, well-informed, and yet we can be curiously insular. It's not so much that we close our eyes to what's happening in the world, it's more that sometimes we put ourselves and our own problems and challenges right at the centre of things. We interpret people and events only if they impact on us. Usually that's marginal. If they don't, they're completely incidental to our story. The special humanitarian one-off intake of an additional 12,000 Syrian and Iraqi refugees to Australia shows that we can be a generous nation and have a capacity to do more. It was actually Tony Abbott's last act as Prime Minister. Admittedly, he had to be dragged screaming and kicking to do it by Liberals like Craig Lundy and others, but he did it. A one-off announcement. Well, we certainly have capacity to do more. The stats show this to be the case. The latest figures were released by UNHCR this week. Australia ranks 59th in the world when it comes to the total number of refugees we host as a proportion of our population. 59th. When it comes to as a proportion of our GDP, our capacity, we rank 95th. Whatever we hear put out, because we are more generous on onshore refugee resettlement, only a few countries do it, so that figure we always get told in the media. 59th as a proportion of population, but as a proportion of GDP, that's the measure that we use for aid. It should be 0.7%. That's what Britain is, legislated, and Scandinavian countries. We, as a percentage of our GDP, when it comes to Australian aid, are 0.21 cents. 20.21, not 0.7. We have slashed aid. As a proportion of GDP for refugees, we come in 95th. So the truth is, the major burden of hosting large refugee populations falls not on the wealthy, not on developed countries, it falls on poor ones. They're the ones doing the heavy lifting. Uganda is one of the poorest countries in the world and hosts over 1 million South Sudanese neighbours. Likewise, it's Pakistan and Iran that dealt with the massive outflow of people fleeing Afghanistan. Rohingyas persecuted in Burma find refuge in Bangladesh by a long majority. Exiled Syrians are in the middle-income Turkey and in poorer Jordan and Lebanon. Lebanon has done an extraordinary job with Syrian refugees when you consider the scale of the crisis and Lebanon's vulnerabilities. It's a pretty small country. It's not that much bigger than metropolitan Melbourne. It has a similar population to metropolitan Melbourne, a fraction of the wealth. Yet the 4 million Lebanese, not without difficulties and inadequacies, have somehow managed to host 1.5 million Syrians. Isn't it extraordinary? Could an Australian city, even a state, come within a bull's roar of that level of accommodation? I'm not suggesting we should, but when we pride ourselves that we're generous, let's get this in perspective. I'd been in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, where World Vision's feeding nearly 100,000 Syrian refugees, there for 6 years, wanting the war to end. I was walking back to my hotel in Beirut, flying out the next day, back to Melbourne, and a voice called me over and said, "Would you like a cup of coffee?" It was a Lebanese man. He spoke good English. He said, "My name's Malek." I said, "I'm Tim." He said, "Come on in." I said, "You speak English?" "Yes, I was an orphan. The nuns took me in. I'm a Christian. I speak good English." I said, "Fine." I walked in. What amazed me was sitting inside his lounge room was about 12 to 15 Syrians. I at first said, "Oh, you've got guests." He said, No, not guests. They live here." I said, "Well, Malik, I shouldn't stay." He said, No, they don't speak English. If you're comfortable, please stay." I said, "Okay." We got talking. I said, "As a Christian, I'm guessing you'd support President Assad." He said, "Yes, he's a monster. But he's an Alawite Shia minority. He'll look after Christians, Druze, the other minorities. If the Sunni rebels that America and others are backing win, I fear for the minorities. It'll be curtains." I said, "What about these Syrian refugees you've been hosting for over 6 months?" "Oh," he said, "they get up each morning, they face toward Mecca, and they pray that the Sunni rebels will win." I said, "Malak, I'm a bit used to political differences in the same family under the same roof. But these political differences are incredible. Why do you do it?" And he looked at me and he said just 2 words or 3 words. He said, "Because they're human." And I was really moved. I know the story of the Good Samaritan, told a few kilometres down the road south. I know in that story the little catch was Jesus said the person Jewish men beat up on the Jericho road was stripped naked. I knew this is why the priest and then the Levite, the fellow Jews, probably passed on by. They couldn't tell if he was one of their mob, their religion, their ethnicity. And of course, the point and power of the story was a Samaritan, hated. He couldn't tell if he was Samaritan, stripped naked. Why did the Samaritan stop and bind up his wounds and care for him? Because he saw a human. This still is the challenge today when we think through our own humanity. Well, Australia has special anxiety about migration. It has deep historical roots in the first century of our European settlement. A remote outpost of the British Empire, the settlers, with a constant eye to the threat posed by rival European powers, fearing an influx of immigrants from nearby Asian countries. The propaganda of the times emphasised with foreigners vice and disease. It was as if we had a fear of infection, and Fortress Australia was to keep away the infection, vice and disease. Competition in the labour market from people coming in was the greatest motivating force. It led to the infamous Immigration Restriction Act, one of the first bills that went through the newly constituted Commonwealth Parliament. No people but whites. It led to the Pacific Islander Act, and those who got in, Kanakas, Solomon Islands, they can go. First 2 acts really of Parliament. George Megalogenis, who you pointed out. He said this was so deep, even on both sides, but particularly in Labor. The Ben Chifley, the great Ben Chifley, when he first ran for Parliament in 1928, you know what his slogan was? Heroes, not Dagos. Even Italians, though they were white, weren't to be allowed in. This is deep within the DNA of Australia. Yet, with restrictions notwithstanding and with numbers waxing and waning over the decades, Australia has somehow maintained an almost continuous immigration flow for most of its modern history. And George Megalogenis has shown that when we have opened ourselves with immigration, we have prospered economically. When we've closed, we've turned back. This is really interesting. Migration to Australia is not an aberration, it's a historical norm. And yet it still gives great rise to dissension and fear and debate. Yes, governments set their targets, they respond to political whims and pressures, though in fact the major cause historically of rises and falls in our migration intake is not policy at all, but the state of our economy and the labour market that most affects migration numbers. It's good old supply and demand, that's the real story here. When economic opportunities are comparatively attractive, people come here to Australia to pursue them. When the economy tanks, the numbers drop off. Hence, in the past couple of years, the net flow across the Tasman has been in New Zealand's favour. First time in decades, our economy flattening out, them doing well. It's actually supply and demand. It's ever thus. When Arthur Corwell initiated the post-war migration program, he initially sought predominantly British and North European immigrants. But as Europe's economies recovered, Marshall Plan, 70th anniversary of this, and as Australia lost its competitive edge as a destination, the government had to look further and further afield. Eventually, we in Australia had to sign agreements with countries like Turkey and Lebanon because of supply and demand. This is the reality of migration worldwide, driven by pull and push factors. And yes, it's the push factors that are most problematic and drive the flow of forced migration that constitutes such a chronic humanitarian challenge. So while our national conversation about refugees tends to focus on the injustice and injury done to people who've done nothing more than seek protection from violence and persecution, that is not the end of the challenge we face. Let me talk about Australia's challenges and opportunities. Offshore processing has been implemented by successive Australian governments and has been unjust, cruel, and also absurdly expensive. I'm saying this at the Bob Hawke lecture tonight, but in mentioning both parties, I bumped at the airport this morning a dignified older Australian who wanted to have a good long chat with me and finally said, "Tim, what are you going to Adelaide for?" I said, I'm going to do the Bob Hawke lecture. And this dignified older Australian said, "Well, that's great. Give them my best wishes. His name is John Howard." Both sides have engaged in this policy. It's a very poor substitute for a genuinely effective regional approach to people movements, often talked about, but which has remained beyond the grasp of Australian politicians and partner governments. Yeah, the United States deal may provide a durable solution for some refugees being held on Nauru and Manus, but it's most likely there'll be many of our refugees left in limbo with no place to go. And it's almost certain there'll be new flows of displaced and desperate people in our region into the future. It's surely important to avoid repeating these disastrous mistakes with devastating human consequences. Much more needs to be done around the settlement in a regional sense, and more needs to be done about integration and settlement of refugee communities in Australia and other countries. It's why the Australian Refugee Association has done such brilliant work in settlement that has made such extraordinary difference, and I think your governor has often paid tribute to that. We shouldn't dismiss community worries about refugees, particularly refugee youth, but recognise the opportunity that exists to invest more effectively in support. Too often young people have been consigned to neglect, social exclusion, low educational attainment, limited economic opportunity, and even, and this is terrible, cultural alienation. Of course, if you experience that, you are much more likely to fall prey to drug culture, crime and extremism. Adjusting to a new society, bridging the cultural gaps has never been easy. Overcoming sharp political and religious divides is not new in this country. Protestant Catholic sectarianism dominated politics here for a generation. I know about it. My father baptised Catholic, my mother Presbyterian. I've grown up with that. It was deep and divisive, and political fault lines were drawn, and we have overcome it. Angst about ethnic crime and gangs here in Australia is an old and familiar theme in our media. The old policy of assimilation never really worked, but against all evidence, there persists an almost naive expectation that the key to harmony is for all newcomers and minorities to assimilate, to lose their identity, to conform to an imagined homogenous and never-changing mainstream. The fact is, the societies change all the time, and Australian society is very dynamic. Those who've lived here for 60,000 years, those who've been here for a few generations, those who arrived last week, are all part of that journey. It began before we were born. We will add a verse to this story, and it will continue in Australia after we're gone. Beside improving our own domestic handling of the challenges of migration and settlement, we also need to look at the global picture and look to the causes as well as the symptoms and consequences of mass forced migration flows. The global picture is one of a humanitarian system that's overstretched, under-resourced, UN agencies and NGOs like us really struggling to meet current demand, let alone future needs, impossible burdens falling on host countries, which are the poorest countries. We desperately need leaders who will step up to this challenge, who will make greater resource commitments, be more proactive, equip the humanitarian sector for the challenge ahead. I've just come back from speaking at the OECD in Paris. The angst there was extraordinary. Danish Prime Minister, Swedish, Chilean, Japanese, lots of leaders there. I was on panels with a few of them. The theme was inclusive growth. Why inclusive growth? Because they said, we at the OECD have failed. We talked about growth and assumed redistribution will just happen. Now, when people have seen all the dividends going to capital, not to wages and humans, globalisation is on the nose, seen as driving inequality. The walls are going up, protectionism is going up. We have failed. How do we actually get a message of only inclusive growth? At least in France there was some hope with Macron winning and beating Le Pen, but extraordinary angst and open admission about the failures of those who, I guess, we would call, certainly Donald Trump would call, the elite. But beyond humanitarian action, we need to focus on the kinds of development and progress that reduces the incidence of humanitarian crises, not just responding afterwards. Natural disasters take a toll. We can pre-position goods. We can do disaster mitigation if we invest in it. The big factors that generate forced migration beyond natural disasters are human making. Poverty, violence, certainly environmental degradation. So we need a global community to say we're far from helpless. We can address this if we have vision, courage and commitment to take real action. We have seen great progress. Extreme poverty is in retreat globally. When I started at World Vision 13, 14 years ago, it was 30,000 kids under the age of 5 dying each day of stupid poverty, dirty water, not having access to medicines, not having access to malaria nets. Today, it's less than 16,000 kids under 5 who'll die from stupid poverty. When people say we're not making progress, they're ignorant. We are making progress. Hundreds of millions have risen from poverty over the past few decades. Not just in Asia, even in Africa, where so many remain pessimistic. There has been such impressive growth rates in many African countries, real progress. Of course, we know of the transformation of China and other Asian nations, and we know we're in a turning point in history. We know that with vision and leadership in a global world which is a waterbed, pressed down here, it comes up here, whether it's refugees or climate change or banking crises, we need leaders to actually have the vision and the courage to act. Well, I've talked about how it's not simply growth, it's got to be inclusive growth, human improved health and opportunities and living standards. It's got to be trade, but it's got to also be aid. The cutting of aid that cuts hope for refugees is disastrous. These are the things that we need leaders to do, and I was pleased that the OECD to at least hear mea culpa, and we have to be serious. We have to step up because we have blown it. Well, these are complex matters, particularly when it's war. We have to remember that when it's war, the burden disproportionately falls on women and children. Half of the 22 million refugees in the world are children. Many are women. War is not caused by abstract forces but human culpability. The breakdown of governance, the absence of legitimate authority, weak and corrupt leadership. But again, we're not helpless. People have varying views on the place of military interventions, on the ethics of preventative interventions that violate state sovereignty, but we need to recognise the importance of investing in governance, in institution building, what we failed to do in South Sudan, in ethical and effective leadership. We need to focus on those issues to neutralise war, such a driver in so many parts of the world. I think my time's nearly up, so let me say that I think there are 3 things that the global community needs to focus its attention on and its resources if we want the kind of world where disruption and displacement are exceptions rather than the norm. Here are these 3 things. Global provision of public goods. A global ethic of governance and leadership, and care for the global commons, for the environment. This is not so different from what allows a household to live a good life. A household needs sufficient goods to support an adequate level of consumption. It needs a set of rules to govern the house that are predictable and fair to everyone in it. It needs a household environment. If it doesn't provide clean air and water, then it can't support healthy family living. It doesn't have a future. It's pretty simple in the household. If the food runs out, or if the peace and order breaks down, or if the environment becomes toxic, don't be surprised if people start heading out the doors. Displacement. Right now, the conditions in global society allow too many Syrias, too many South Sudans, too many wars and famines, and people flee their homes, arriving in stopgap settlements like Bidi. Whether it's collective or whether it's individual, we need the leadership to focus on those 3 things. Global provision of public goods, global ethic of governance, and global care of the commons. I remain an optimist. That's not simply, I hope, being naive, but as a citizen working in the humanitarian space, I actually believe that how we deal with displacement goes to my humanity, goes to your humanity, goes to our global humanity. This refugee week, I've heard good friends of Australia, we've had good friends of Australia who've been out here, global experts and leaders, Jan Egeland, Helen Clark, and they've been saying things that we need to hear, that Australia can and should do better. To those friends, Jan and Helen, I say thank you. Sometimes it helps if a friend says what needs to be said. So let's rise to the challenge and seize the opportunity. Make a date in your diary for a year from now. Make a date in your diary for 5 years from now, a date in your diary for 10 years from now. Give yourself a reminder with those dates to ask a couple of questions when that date comes around. How many people, how many children are displaced around the world because of avoidable causes? Is it more or less than in 2017? Are their living conditions and their prospects for finding a place of safety, a decent life, better or worse than they were in 2017? And in the years since 2017, what positive contribution has your government made? Are you satisfied with your government's effort? And in the years since 2017, what have you done to make a difference? Thank you.
Food for thought. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we do have about 10 minutes with questions. Did you know about that?
I do now.
Good. He can work on the fly. So we have some microphones in the audience. If you have a question for Tim, please hold up your hand and we'll make sure we've got one right here, nice and close to the microphone.
Tim, I have a question on behalf of a lady called Anissa who's unable to be here. Anissa has asked, what's happening to your head representative in Gaza for World Vision? Has he been released from the Israeli prison? And when will World Vision continue its great work in Gaza?
Thank you for that question. So one of our employees who we rate very highly, Mohammed Al-Halabi, was arrested. The news that went out across YouTube and elsewhere from the government of Israel was that $50 million of World Vision money had been diverted by this Mohammed Al-Halabi, which was interesting for us since in his whole time of employment with us, our total program in Gaza has only been $22.5 million, so how clever were we, or he? He is still detained. We are very close to a trial. He has been saying, I did nothing, I want to go to trial. We have continued to support him. We now know, because it's been reported, so I can say this, that the prosecution literally have come and said to him, will you just take a plea deal of just a few years? Now, if he had diverted not just 50 million, Mohammed Barghouti, who's a Palestinian who diverted a whole lot of money, I think it was 10 million, got 5 life sentences, you wouldn't be being offered a plea deal of a very short time by the prosecutor for the government of Israel. So we know that his courage of saying, I didn't do anything wrong, I can't at the end of the day say I know for sure. We, on the 14th of July, will be having a report come out, a forensic audit by one of the big four that has been going 6 months. I have seen a little bit of the outcomes of that audit, and without announcing that audit before it comes out, I'm very pleased that audit's going to come out. It's looked at all of our money, but he, at the moment, still remains under arrest.
I've just got a question from myself, but I think many members of the audience might have similar questions. You said that, the thing that keeps you going is that humanity and that hope, and every now and then you see something and you think, I've made a difference. Regarding the media and our overall messaging, have you seen any windows of hope there, or are we all going to hell in a handbasket? I mean, is there going to be a change?
So I saw hope in the frankness of the conversation in Paris. There was real contrition. I had been leading what's called civil society, which is part of the G20, C20, and I reminded the leaders that it was when civil society actually marched in the streets and said, how come Microsoft, Facebook, who are the others? Google are not paying their tax. For the first time, Western leaders, they'd always said developing countries are where the corruption is. For the first time, Western leaders said, oh dear. And Gordon Brown, David Cameron, other leaders have said, we now are actually understanding it's not simply inequality that gets people upset. The world's always been unequal. Some people are better at business and making money than others. We're used to that. It's unfairness that there's different sets of rules. So for corporates, different sets of rules, transfer pricing, or for the rich where it becomes optional to pay tax, or for CEOs, because it's a global market, to pay themselves 400 times the salary of someone who works for them. There's different rules. And here was the OECD saying, we actually have aided and abetted that unfairness, and we have failed. And then the talk turned to Europe and the migration of people there and said the geopolitics of Europe have actually been challenged because we did not deal with Syria. The Syrian war couldn't have gone on for more than a year without great powers, Iran and Russia behind Assad, us and America, Saudi Arabia behind the rebels, funding and giving the guns as a proxy war. This is a fundamental failure of the international architecture, which I was alluding to about global governance. Not global government, global governance. And these leaders were saying the challenge in Europe is because we failed there. And if we think that immigration was big, if we can't settle North Africa and some of the demographic time bomb of young people in Africa, that will make Syrian refugees look a drop in the bucket. We actually have to have fair rules, fair trade, fair aid, global governance to settle war. I got some hope there. And, of course, you have hope sitting in front of you with a governor here too. That's the other story.
We do indeed. Another question? Yes, down the front there.
Another failure seemed to be that most of these problems arise as the results of actions of a lot of powerful, if not psychopathic men.
So glad you said that. It's exactly what I've been thinking for years.
Can you see any signs of any change in this gender imbalance?
Well...
Yes! I love you.
We have a program called Channels Hope in World Vision, which is actually about domestic violence. It's interesting that in the Pacific, where there's very few women in Parliament, where men are still treating women in terrible ways, this program, Channels of Hope, is working not just at the individual family level, but getting women into Parliament, and lots of others are trying. I mean, it's interesting, you've got on one hand Angela Merkel, who seems to be one of the few adult leaders left in the world. Angela's story is fascinating. She actually was born and living in Hamburg. Her father was a Lutheran minister. When the wall starts going up, east and west, her father, with others, says, I'm going to take my family to the east to show solidarity with those suffering under communism. That's why Angela Merkel grew up in East Germany. And I kept wondering about Angela until how magnificent she was with the refugees who started coming in. I saw the daughter of her father, her own experience. Now, I think you're absolutely right about getting women in leadership. I think empathy, whether you're male or female, that's why I tell the Angela Merkel story, something changes you. We know that people are homophobic until there's a gay person in their family or they meet someone who's a neighbour who they didn't know was gay but they were really nice and found out later. We know people are anti-refugees until they meet a refugee and they go, wow, exactly the same. I think the empathy and the encounter, male or female's the key, but absolutely agree with you on the gender imbalance.
I've got one final question for you. Are you on blood pressure medication?
No, I'm not. Any other easy questions?
No, that one's fine. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Tim Costello. I told you he was a good egg. I really did. Thank you. Well done. That was fantastic. Now could I please welcome to the lectern the President of the Australian Refugee Association. She is also the Deputy Chief Executive of the Department for Communities. So she is a woman who certainly works in this field every single day, and she does a magnificent job. So please welcome Lois Boswell.
Thanks, Amanda. First of all, can I acknowledge that the land that we meet on today is the traditional land of the Kaurna people and pay my respects to elders past and present. Your Excellency, patron of ARA, and I'm very proud to say one of the Australian Refugee Association's very first clients. To the board members and the staff and the volunteers of ARA and to all of you that have come tonight, thank you very much. Thank you to the Reverend Tim Costello, National Living Treasurer. Thank you for telling us not to lose hope, to rise above the toxic debate about boat people in this country, to find our humanity, to invest in public goods, to invest in a global ethic and in commons, but most importantly, to paint, to dance, to hug and draw with displaced people because they're human. Thank you. That really is a message that we at ARA are just very grateful to have you spread for all humanity. Thank you to Jacinta Thompson and to the Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre for being such amazing supporters of ARA and for hosting the Oration each year and also our portrait exhibition. It's been, we are honoured for that association. Just a little bit about ARA for those of you who don't know. We're in our 42nd year now. I think you said earlier something can last 42 years. It's got to be pretty good. It's the Australian Refugee Association was established in 1975. We work with our dedicated staff and our amazing volunteers to support refugees and other new arrivals to settle in Australia with independence and dignity and to develop and achieve their aspirations and opportunities in life. ARA's mission is to help refugees become settled and participating citizens in Australia and to foster as many future governors as we can. We believe the capacity and the desire of refugees to be productive citizens through contributing to social, cultural and economic life in Australia is awe-inspiring. ARA provides many services in areas of settlement, migration, youth, employment, social activities, support, community education and skills development. Some of our truly special programs include regular homework clubs, family support volunteers, employment services, youth mentoring, accommodation casework, youth ambassador programs, sewing circles, men's sheds, just to name a few. I get a real privilege to be involved with ARA, and I get to have uplifting conversations every time I engage with ARA clients, staff and volunteers. This week's Refugee Week, as most of you will know, and I have had pleasure of attending some events this week. This week for me started seeing our staff cook an amazing iftar dinner for many of our clients and have lots of Syrian families turn up to that iftar dinner. I was told later that there was a woman there who hadn't been out in the many months that she'd been in Adelaide in Australia, and that was her first time going out, and by the end of the night she didn't want to go home and had made friends. But for me, a really special part of the evening was some of the community leaders came up to me at the end and said, look, we really want to thank ARA for hosting this. It's so special to be invited to something like this. We feel very, very privileged to be here, and if there's anything we can do for ARA, please let us know. And next year we'd like to be able to thank you in English. And I, was more than a little bit teary at that moment. I say all of this because I'm hitting you up for money. And I'm doing that shamelessly, even though I find that quite an awkward thing to do. This organisation does incredible work. We're going to try something new. Standing at the door as you leave will be people with EFTPOS machines. You know that tap and go thing? Pull your card out. One side will have $50 and $50 will buy us some school uniforms. We have a lot of large Syrian families arriving at the moment, and they're struggling to get uniforms and to get school supplies, etc. On the other side, there'll be somebody with a $75 machine that'll allow us to pay for some school scholarships. So I'd really like you to consider doing that. If you haven't made it into the tap and go generation, then I'd just feel free to give us a note, give us a check, whatever. We're not shy. But my final task of the night is to introduce Apu Nyang. Apu is from South Sudan. She's a Year 12 student at Nazareth College. She came to Australia in 2006. And she's interested in helping others. She's one of this year's ARA Youth Ambassadors. We're very, very proud of our Youth Ambassador program. I went for a little while to the Youth Ambassador camp about a month or two ago, and those young people are just, they rock your world in terms of their ethics, their values, their beliefs. They're willing to speak up. Apu is very interested in helping others and advocating for racial rights. She's also a passionate singer and dancer, I hear. She's decided to become an ARA Youth Ambassador to promote understanding and acceptance. Her mum's here supporting her tonight, but she also still has family back in Sudan and is always looking for ways to help them. And Apu is going to give us some slam poetry. So I'd like you to welcome Apu to the stage. Thank you very much.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Apu Nyang, and today I'll be presenting you guys a poem titled Don't Label Me. This poem was written based on a story that I heard at the Refugee Youth Ambassadors camp, and it's about an asylum seeker that came here at the age of 16, and he spoke about the opportunities he couldn't get because he was an asylum seeker. So, yeah. This is a relegation against migration. You have a problem with it like this is even your country. How do you discover something that wasn't missing to begin with? It is us being told that we are threats to neighborhoods, but don't forget your own continents. It is innocent voices not being heard. It is the word terrorist being thrown to you like your parents never gave you a name. It is that innocent girl sitting over there, should she feel ashamed? You label me like I ain't more than just a terrorist and asylum seeker. Don't forget both person. Try to fight for myself, that's just another terrorist action, and trust me, you never hear about this in no election. Why has humanity chosen to turn their backs against all these inhumane acts? So I ask myself, what is multicultural Australia? Is it us celebrating Australia Day but not accepting everybody's Australians? Is it us pretending our national anthem doesn't state for those who have come across the seas with boundless plains to share? So why are we still choosing not to be fair? Ladies and gentlemen, today I stand here as an individual that is part of a movement in which we comb the diversities of Australia, because at the end of the day, we all call this place home.
Well done, Apu. That was fantastic. Well done to you. Awesome stuff. Now, that pretty much concludes our lecture this evening, or our oration. As we said earlier, this video will be available on the Hawke Centre website and on the ARA site in the next few coming weeks. Tickets are on sale now for the second Our Table dinner, ARA's gala fundraising event, which will be held at Plant 4 Bowden on Saturday the 19th of August. So if you are interested in connecting further with ARA, that is a fantastic way to do it. Please, again, if we could just thank the Hawke Centre, the Governor of South Australia, Hugh Van Ley, Tim Costello, thank you so much for coming. Lois, magnificent. And I love the fact that Lois works for the government. She says, I feel uncomfortable about asking you for money. Yeah, right. Okay. I love that. Thank you, Lois. That was awesome. So, please, if you can, consider making a donation on your way out. PayWave just makes it so easy to give money. So if you could do that on the way out, that would be great. And for those of you that have been invited to the VIP reception, please proceed to the upper level door and make your way into the gallery. For the rest of you that haven't been invited to that, it was nothing that you did. It was just a numbers issue. However, if you would like to catch up with Tim Costello a little bit later on tonight, he'll be at the casino. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night. Thank you.